morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Isabel Rohr, and I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Global Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture by Tracy Slater. This is the fourth and last program in our webinar series, Across Oceans, Across Cultures, Jewish Refuge in East Asia, and the Role of JDC. Before we start today's program, I'd like to share a few words about the JDC Archives. The JDC Archives holds the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC, or the Joint, which is the leading Jewish humanitarian organization that has been providing assistance to Jews around the world for more than a century. Our collections are rich and wide-ranging. They include millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, and a large number of audio, video, and film recordings. Some of these materials go all the way back to the organization's founding in 1914. Our Holocaust-era records are especially extensive since JDC was active in Jewish communities across the globe during that time. These resources are used constantly, not just by scholars, but also by publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and many others from around the world. A big part of what makes our collection so accessible is that much of the material has been digitized and is available online. This allows a broad international audience to explore and use the archives from wherever they are. We also support researchers through several fellowship opportunities that encourage deeper engagement with the JDC archives and help expand scholarship on our collections. One of these fellowships is the Sorrel and Lauren Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established in 2015 thanks to the generosity of Dr. Sorrel and Lauren Chessin. Sorrel and Lauren are longtime supporters of JDC with deep roots in higher education and a lasting commitment to academic research and scholarship. We're so glad that Sorrel and Lauren could join us today, and we're very grateful for their generosity. Our speaker today, Tracy Slater, received the Sorrel and Lauren Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship in 2025. Tracy Slater is an American writer based in her husband's country of Japan. She received a PhD in English and American literature from Brandeis University. She taught for over 10 years in Boston area universities and in men's and women's prisons throughout Massachusetts. Her work focuses on the intersection of Jewish and Japanese culture and history. Her current project uncovers the story of Jewish refugees who found temporary shelter in Kobe, Japan during World War II. Her previous book was the narrative history, Together in Manzanar, the true story of a Japanese Jewish family in an American concentration camp. She has also published work in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Time Magazine's Made by History, the Jewish Book Council's Paper Brigade, and more. She's the recipient of the PEN New England Friend to Writers. Tracy Slater will present for about 40 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are turned off, and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the program. Tracy Slater will now start her lecture.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Before I begin, I want to give my thanks to the JDC Archives for supporting this research. These archives are an integral part of the research for this entire project, which I hope will be my next book. And I want to give special thanks to Dr. Isabel Rohr, Amy Lester, and to Abra Cohen from the JDC, and to Dr. Sorrell and Lauren Chesson for the generous grant. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history behind the Kobe Passage, the lost stories within it, and JDC's role in them. Then, for the next slide, sorry, can I just get the next slide? Thank you very much. Okay. The next slide, this slide shows the journey of Exodus that happened between 1940 and 1941, from the threat of mass murder in Europe to safety and survival in Kobe, Japan, and ultimately, which is not on the map, to points onward. It's a story that covers about 4,000 refugees in total, most of whom originally escaped from Poland to Lithuania, where they discovered a Japanese diplomat who would give them transit visas through Japan, allowing them a way out of Europe when most countries and places were slamming the door on Jewish refugees. Or as one member of the Jewish community who assisted them in Kobe put it in 1942, quote, "These involuntary Jewish immigrants, driven out of their homes, persecuted, hunted down, turned to the ports of Japan, from where they tried to arrange safe passage onward." So between July 1940 and mid-1941, these refugees undertook in waves a journey from Lithuania across Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok. That's the rail part of the journey is in red on the map. In Vladivostok, they boarded a boat to Suruga, Japan. That's in blue. And then in Suruga, Japan, they were met by representatives of a small Ashkenazi Jewish community who had settled in Kobe previously. It was about 25 families who had settled in the earlier part of the 1900s. And these refugees were taken to Kobe by train, which is the green sort of part of the map. Or the green dots. They were taken to Kobe, where they lived, some for a matter of weeks, some for a matter of months, and some for almost a year. And almost every single one of them survived. Not one of them was harmed in Kobe by the Japanese government or Japanese civilians, despite the fact that Japan was formally and militarily aligned with Nazi Germany from September 1940 on. So for the greater parts of these events. And the reason I think that we need to tell this story now, there are multiple reasons. One is because the story of the Japanese diplomat, whose name was Chiune Sugihara, the story of this diplomat who gave the refugees transit visas through Japan, it's one of goodness and heroism, and it has been rightfully acknowledged, and that's really important and wonderful. But it has been told many times in both scholarly and popular texts, as well as movies, articles, young adult books. And so again, this is important and it's heartening that the part of the story with Sugihara has been told. But the extraordinary bravery and the incredible will to survive shown by the refugees themselves and the Jewish community at large who supported them, I feel that this needs to be more fully highlighted. To anyone who still sees Europe's Jews as passive victims, which of course is a deep understanding, this story really needs to be highlighted. For the history to be uncovered and highlighted in order to honor these refugees and their incredible will to survive and the community that supported them, this needs to be emphasized more. And also, I think it's important to uncover the forces and dynamics between the refugees and the Jewish community that was based in Japan, the small Jewish community, Kobe Jewish community, and the JDC and the larger global Jewish community that supported them. It's important, I think, to uncover the forces and dynamics between them and the Japanese population that allowed these refugees to escape and survive almost uniformly. And here, I believe, is where we can find perhaps the strongest resonance or meaning for our contemporary lives and global challenges. So I'll explain all of this a little bit in more detail as the talk goes on. But I wanted to add that the story of the Japan part of this of this exodus, this long escape. The story of the Japan part has actually been the least documented of this amazing escape, which for about half the refugees who went to Kobe or went to Japan, they ended up getting visas out of Japan to other lands before the end of 1941. And for the other half who could not get visas out in time, this included being shipped to Shanghai, which was controlled by Japan at that time, where they waited out the war. And also, as well as the story of Sugihara having been well documented, the story of the Shanghai ghetto, where, as I said, about half these refugees ended up. The story of the Shanghai ghetto has also been well documented, but this middle passage through Japan has not been. And for the sake of time right now, I won't explain my conjectures about why it hasn't been, or the multiple reasons I think it hasn't been well documented yet. But I will say that, to my mind at least, this passage through Kobe is actually the most fascinating part of this entire exodus. Because for the refugees, it was the only part of their escape where they were living amongst a civilian population that was officially aligned with the Nazis, or whose government was officially aligned with the Nazis. And when I first uncovered this hidden chapter, it left me with so many questions. What was it like? How did they survive? How did the Japanese population react to them? How did Kobe change them, and how did they change Kobe? And what significance does this historical chapter hold for us today, and particularly for the challenges that we face in the world today? So if we can move to the next slide, I will quickly just sort of scrape the surface of the story of Chunahara, because I'm just so that the rest of the part based in Kobe makes sense, and you have some context for it. But again, this has all been really well documented and written about, and I'm happy to pass along any resources that people are interested in. If you want to contact me, I'll give that information of how to do that later. So from the basic history and context is that from July 9th to August 31st, 1940, Sugihara, who was the vice consul, Japanese vice consul in Kaunas or Kobno, he issued 2,139 visas to people or families. A family could travel under a visa. The background of how he came to know about these Jewish refugees and how he gave them transit visas is complicated. So for now, let me just summarize very broadly. I'm paraphrasing here a summary that was written by the historian Pamela Schatzkes. So from October 1939 until May 1940, over 10,000 Jews fled occupied Poland, seeking refuge in neutral Lithuania. And by July 15th, 1940, when the Soviet Union annexed Lithuania, these refugees, most of whom had no N visas to other countries, they were stranded. One of the leaders of the Jewish community in Vilna and then eventually in Kobe was a lawyer named Dr. Warhaftik, and he discovered that the Dutch honorary consul, Jan Zwartendijk, was willing to stamp into passports a notation saying that Curaçao, which was the Dutch East Indies, that Curaçao did not require an entry visa. And the Dutch honorary consul agreed to do this. And realizing the implications for thousands of refugees, Warhaftik persuaded the authorities to issue similar declarations in other passports. And this furnished these documents with the illusion of an entry visa and was the crack through which to obtain a Japanese transit visa. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see part of this quote. And on the basis of this stamp, the Japanese consul in Kobno, Sugihara, issued 7 to 15-day transit visas through Japan. Sorry. The part of this quote, the crack through which to obtain transit visas and to gain safe passage through Kobe, is actually a quote it's from Pamela Schatzkes' seminal study, but it's a quote from an unpublished interview that she did with Lee Yohanan, who was another one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Kobe. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the Japanese writing characters for Kobe. No historian that I know has yet remarked upon this, but I feel like there's this sort of beautiful symmetry to Shotsky's quote from Hanan, because Kobe literally means God's door. And so this illusion of an entry visa and then Sugihara's issuance of the transit visa became the crack through which these refugees could undertake their exodus through God's door, as if the seam of Asia had suddenly parted for them and they were able for this very brief moment to escape. And so the escape entailed a 10 to 12 day trip to Vladivostok over the Trans-Siberian Railway, and then the boat trip from Vladivostok to Suruga was about a day. If the weather was bad, it could take up almost 2 days. And in Suruga, they were met by the representatives of the Jewish community. As I said, this small community of about 25 Ashkenazi families who were known as Jewcom. And they were known as Jewcom for their telegraphic address, which is something that appears again and again in the JDC archives. And then the Jewcom representatives took them on this 100-mile train ride from Suruga to Kobe. So some stayed, as I alluded to, only a couple of weeks before getting a visa onwards, while an approximate 36% of them, so a little over a third, actually got stuck in Kobe with no way out. And some, despite having transit visas that were only for 7 to 15 days, some ended up staying for up to 8 months, and the Japanese government gave them permission to do so. I'll say very briefly that there were also in Kobe refugees who were German Jews and German Jewish refugees concentrated in a smaller community in Yokohama. And in Kobe, there were also Jews from other European countries other than Poland, some of whom actually took alternate routes to Kobe and got there without Sugihara visas. But for this talk, I'm going to focus almost exclusively on Kobe, although I will give a brief statistic from the historian Pamela Sakamoto, who has found that, and I'm quoting here, although no Japanese office had issued as many transit visas as Sugihara's tiny consulate in Kaunas had, the offices in Hamburg, Stockholm, Vienna, Moscow, and Berlin were still active up until March of 1940, before March of 1941. And between January 1940 and March of 1941, 3,377 transit visas were issued by the above diplomatic offices, all combined, in comparison to the around 2,132 issued by Sugihara in Kaunas. So there were many refugees in Japan who had gotten to Japan without Sugihara visas. And there were many other diplomats who had helped save them. Sugihara helped save the most, if you just look at his numbers. So as for the refugees in Kobe, there are 7 to 15-day permit visas. Some of the other consulates that Sakamoto referenced gave slightly longer transit visas. The most I've seen was about between 3 and 4 weeks. But in any case, the refugees had their permit visas repeatedly extended by, in the words of a report written by the JUCOM officials, a, quote, Japanese government that has shown itself to be singularly lenient in this matter. Despite being an incredibly rule-bound country, and one, of course, that was officially and militarily aligned, as I said, with Nazi Germany after the Tripartite Pact signed on September 27th of 1940. So the next slide will show a picture of the JUCOM office and the wall that was sort of on the side of the office. And the refugees survived in Kobe through the logistical and financial support of JUCOM and with great financial support from the JDC, as well as a few other resources of funding, such as the Jewish Community Immigration Aid Organization, HISEM. And if we go to the next slide, we can see a picture of the office and a clearer picture of the office at the time in either 1940 or 1941. And then another, I think, very touching picture of the wall today. There's about 10 feet of the wall today remaining, and this is a picture of one of the refugees returning to Japan in 2023, I think, yeah, and touching the wall. So the next page will give some statistics of the arrivals and the numbers. You can see a timeline of both the arrivals and the breakdown of countries of origin throughout this time frame. The chart showing the arrivals, departures, and the number of people stranded without visas or funds onward at the end of each month was one that was created by another one of JUCOM's leaders, Anatol Ponevsky. And as we can see, the numbers of arrivals and people stranded began to peak in February and March of 1941, which also corresponds to when the wave of mostly Polish, as opposed to, in general, German refugees arrived in Kobe. So if we go to the next slide, we can see more statistics. The historian Pamela Sakamoto has documented, as have others, that the greatest number of arrivals occurred in February and March and brought more than 800 people each month. In terms of local Japanese studies, this Japanese government prefectural report. So a prefecture here is like a state. The Hyogo prefecture is the kind of state in which, the state in which Kobe is located. So this prefectural government report breaks down the nationalities further, and it highlights the preponderance of Polish refugees who got stranded. And in general, these were the ones with Sugihara visas. The next slide will show us when they left, if they left, and where they went. So approximately 3,500 refugees were had departed Japan by August 1941. And the remaining 1,000 were transferred to Shanghai in August and September 1941. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. These latter dates were impacted by ostensibly by Japan's preparation for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, although there's no remaining documentation that says, we're preparing for the bombing of Pearl Harbor now, and by the fact that no ships could leave Japan for U.S. or British territory after the U.S. oil embargo on Japan on August 1st. Ponevsky's chart looks as though he might have combined the U.S. and Canada, but I think that that's actually because the refugees who ended up emigrating to Canada would go through the U.S. first. The ships would dock in the U.S. first. So that explains those numbers. The next slide it'll give us a glimpse into the JDC archives. So on the left is a letter from JUCOM to the JDC in February 1941, and I just want to highlight in the second paragraph. The type of refugee we have to deal with has completely changed of late. So this traces the changing situation of the refugees starting around February 1941, both in nationality of origin and in the situation once they arrive in Kobe. And you'll note the appeal on the right in the telegram. The appeal and sort of the tone becomes more urgent as the numbers increase sharply, and this group of 25 families who are making up JUCOM the funds are really being stretched to support these huge waves of immigrants coming in. I also want to just, if we go to the next slide, we can see a more personal glimpse of the refugees who were arriving. We can also see that there were children arriving among the refugees, in this case as young as 4 years old. And I just want to explain quickly that you'll note that the numbers are different from the Japanese prefectural estimates that I showed earlier, partly because counting perfectly was difficult, but also more specifically because this lists the numbers of arrivals, not at this time, not the total number of people residing in Kobe at the time. So if we look at the next slide, this is a quote that comes from a JUCOM report written by the JUCOM leaders that describes the dire situation of the refugees, particularly those arriving as part of this wave in February and March. And the Japanese language newspaper, the Osaka Mainichi. So Osaka was sort of the biggest city close to Kobe. It's right. I'm actually in Osaka right now, and Kobe is sort of, right at one city over. The Osaka Mainichi on February 15th, 1941, reported similar conditions. In translation, the headline was "Dressed only in what they wore on arrival." 300 more arrived in Kobe yesterday. So 300 more refugees arrived in Kobe yesterday. And it begins, "From the firestorm that is Europe. At 4:48 p.m. yesterday, Jewish refugees arrived in Kobe again at Sannomiya Station. Guided by the Jewish community of Kobe, they entered the hotels in the area, but the hotels were too crowded, with already 440 Jews waiting. This caused a stir to rent and wholly occupy 2 private houses and an apartment nearby." So, given this enormous task of supporting this veritable flood of refugees, JUCOM turned in large part to the JDC, as suggested by the previous February telegram. And as JUCOM leaders themselves explained it, the Jewish community of Kobe, of course, could not mobilize in its own circle the necessary funds for the upkeep of so many people and the assurance of their further travels and fate. Here, the committee met the great understanding and fervent response of the Jewish organization, the Joint Distribution Committee, which is rightly compared to the worldwide Red Cross Society. So the next slide will give us a sense of budgets. The JDC's overall estimated allocations for the 1940 to 1941 period were about 160,000. The JDC archives show $158,284 allocated to refugees in Japan during these 8 months. And according to, if you run this number through a Federal Reserve Bank calculator in today's dollars, or in 2025, which is the last full year, it would equal almost $3.5 million. Also, just to explain, if you're looking at the JUCOM balance sheet, that in 1940, 1941, the exchange rate was about 4.27 yen to a dollar. So that will help make sense of the yen, the numbers in yen. And JUCOM's own documentation sent to the JDC in February 1941 shows that about 45% of the budget went to food and lodging, and the rest went to medical care, travel, and cables and telegrams, which are very frequent. And it's wonderful that JDC has copies of these in the archives and has made them available to researchers online, so you can research them from anywhere. And the travel actually was there were many fees associated with the travel as well. There were disembarkation fees when they arrived in Japan, rail tickets to Kobe and then to consulates in Yokohama and Tokyo, fees related to emigrating onwards. There were luggage transport fees. So there were many different costs, and the budget's broken down in a different way. These costs are broken down in a different way on the right. This is another chart compiled again by Ponevesky in early 1942. And the next slide shows how the community dealt with clothing. The clothing was mostly managed through donations from local families, organized by and for the most part, by the wives and mothers of JUCOM families. And clothing was also donated by Jews in Harbin and Darien, which were in Japanese occupied Manchuria. At that point was known as Manchukuo. The next slide will show just another quick view of the Women's Committee. And then the slide after shows JUCOM's official leadership, which is the men. I just want to quickly note, in case anyone's confused with this slide, this is the pictures from and the caption are both from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I think the caption's off a little because Anatole Ponve and Anatole Ponevsky are listed twice, but they're actually the same person. He changed his name after moving to the U.S., so I think maybe someone wrote in and identified this person twice, but one of them is not that person. So the next slide shows the Japanese prefectural government's perspective on the living conditions of and the aid for the refugees. It shows as of March 31st, the survey by the Hyogo prefecture government showed, I wanted to highlight in particular, that 1 loaf of bread per day was provided by the mediation of Hyogo Prefecture's Foreign Affairs Division to prevent the refugees from wandering the city in search of bread. So it's both a gesture of goodwill and charity, but also one that had a practical edge to it. JUCOM's documentation shows slightly different numbers at slightly different times. Their documentation shows that in March of 1941, there were 20 homes that had been rented, among whom lived 1,119 refugees. 1,019 refugees. 786 were men, 175 were women, 58 were children, and the minimum housed 21 people. The maximum housed 116. So this would be people in per house, not room, and which explains some of the discrepancy with the prefectural government's perspective. And in April of 1941, 21 homes were open for 1,045 people, 993 of whom were from Poland, 47 were from Germany, and 5 were from elsewhere. And why Western-style houses? Because there was a foreign settlement in Kobe where many British and American traders had set up house after the opening of Japan in the late 1800s. And after Japan signed the 1938 Comintern alliance with Germany, these residents were urged by British and U.S. governments to leave Japan. And it left many of these houses, which were quite large by Japanese standards, left many of these houses open for rent. As for the refugees crowded into these houses, in the words of JUCOM's leaders, most of their time was spent literally trying to get out, to get visas onwards. Sometimes also they needed passports and always money for passage. 1942 JUCOM report put it this way: this work, the work of trying to emigrate out, of trying to get out of Japan, this work is generally animated by the refugees themselves, who are driven by an inner fire. In each burns the desire, now that he stands on the threshold of a new world, to bring an end to his wanderings. And if we go to the next slide, you can see this is what they were desperately trying to get, a visa onward. In this case, it's a transit visa through British-controlled territory to South Africa. Leon Palmers, who was a musician and a refugee, said of his time in Kobe in his testimony about it, "I stayed in Japan 7 months, but my whole life was centered on getting a visa out. This was the beginning and end of the day." But of course, in Japan, they were safe. Only 2 deaths occurred among the refugees, and JUCOM reported 6 births as well, actually, during the refugees' time in Kobe. So if we go to the next slide, I want to give you a few pictures to give you a sense of the scene that the refugees might have seen and experienced in Kobe, also in other parts of Japan. And I'll read a couple of snippets from historical studies and testimony from the refugees themselves, again, to give you a sense of what it really felt like for them, as much as we can know. Samuel Mansky, who was unfortunately passed away, who was a former refugee whom I interviewed, described Japan from the moment of arrival in Suruga as like a fairy tale. Pamela Sakamoto, the historian herself, did an interview with a former member of JUCOM who recalled that as soon as the ships anchored in Suruga, actually there was only one ship going back and forth at a time, but as soon as the ship anchored in Suruga, he or another representative would board it to assist the entry process. Although refugees were always advised to state that Curacao was their destination, some inevitably by accident mentioned the U.S. Local Japanese officials would then call a JUCOM representative over, and he would quietly correct the refugees. Everyone knew half the visas were false, he said. Some people even came without visas. The JUCOM representative would quickly issue them, while the Japanese officials waited, watched, and stamped the papers with the, quote, ink still wet. Some refugees carried identical papers right down to the name, number, and date. These amateur attempts at fooling the punctilious Japanese officials were the product of underground stamp-making shops in Vilna. Yet this local member of the Kobe Jewish community recalled, quote, the officer would look at it quickly and cover it as quickly because it was so obviously false, but in the interest of allowing the refugee to enter with the appearance, at least, of having paperwork in order. Okay, so the next slide will show a picture of one picture of the house where, actually two pictures on the bottom of different houses where the refugees lived, and of refugees gathering together in Kobe in different contexts. The former refugee Belia Mintz, who was a child at the time that she was a refugee in Kobe, in her oral testimony recalled, there was no fear in Japan. As a matter of fact, my sister had this light blonde hair, very thin like a baby, and it was curled like a little sheep. We used to walk with her, and the Japanese used to come over and touch it. Many of them had never seen Europeans until that time, so they used to just feel her hair and look at her. And another refugee, Marcel Wayland, who's actually the one you saw in the picture of the wall today, he wrote a memoir, and in his memoir, he explained, in Kobe, we were allotted a place to stay together with a number of refugees. This was a section of a typical Japanese two-story house in the shape of a rectangle, with a smaller rectangular landscaped garden within it. The floors were covered with 6-foot by 3-foot mats. These would have been tatami, like straw mats. We cooked on small charcoal stoves. I soon began attending a little school run by American Methodist missionaries within easy walking distance, mainly with the aim of improving my English. When not there, I spent much time in the Motomachi district and the lovely street of that name. We called it the Lily of the Valley Street because it was lined with streetlights which looked quite like the flower. It also contained the main Daimaru shopping center with its cafeteria, where as often as I could, I ordered a yakisoba, a pasta dish I found irresistible. In fact, I never tried another. And the next picture, the next slide, shows a picture. I actually couldn't find a picture of the Daimaru department store, but I did find one of the Sogo department store at the time, which is right around the corner. It's all in the same area. And you can also see at the bottom Motomachi Street. Which is with the Lily of the Valley lights, this is all in the area of Sanamiya, which is where most of the refugees lived. There's also a picture of Tor Road, which runs through Sanamiya. So these are the kinds of things the refugees might have seen at the time. But as Pamela Shotsky's notes, refuge in Japan did not provide relief from the sense of responsibility for family and friends left behind. Quote, many spent part of their meager allowance sending food parcels home, which on the whole reached their destination until the outbreak of the Russo-German War, which would have been June 1941. The Polish refugee Solomon S. This is from the Fortunoff Video Archive, which doesn't give full names. So this Polish refugee Solomon S. In his videotape testimony discussed having some correspondence and some connections with his family back in Poland while he was in Japan. And he said, we wrote to them and I received postal cards back. We wrote it in Yiddish and German and so we had to be careful what we wrote because of the censors. And they wrote back. not the censors in Japan, the censors in Europe. They were afraid, of course. They lived in constant fear. I wrote a card to my uncle in Zagreb. The response came, and it was stamped with a German Haken, the official stamp, and they'd renamed the city. Instead of Zagreb, they named it Hindenburg. So there's these glimpses of what's happening, of the German takeover, that people can read between the lines and guess that the situation is even worse than it was when they had left. Leon Palmers, who is a musician and a refugee, in his oral testimony, explained, all of us, after all, almost everybody left someone behind. And there was also mourning of the life left behind, not just the people. Leon Palmers, in the same testimony, explained he was a musician, and he finally found a piano that someone would let him play in Kobe. And when he found the piano, he sat down to play, and he said he just cried. In another oral testimony, Stephen Percal, who is a member of the Bund, describes how in Japan, having a sense through correspondence of what his family was going through back in Warsaw, particularly by reading through the lines of the correspondence, said that what he felt was, quote, fear, numbness, desperation, and emptiness. And most of the time it was emptiness. The fear was at night. The emptiness was during the day. You had to go around and do the things, the everyday things. When I was in Japan, the everyday things were trying to get somewhere, to get to the Polish army. I went for interviews. I went to Tokyo to the Polish embassy. And then the interviewer asks if there was anyone to share your thoughts or feelings with at that moment. And he answers, we didn't. We didn't. We spoke only of everyday things. When the news sometimes came in, we spoke about the news. Feelings? And he pauses here for a minute. And then he says, very seldom, very seldom. And it was very rare to find someone that you could sit down and share this with. It was as if the other things did not exist because it was too dangerous. Everybody knew it was too dangerous to talk about. So moving on to the next slide, the Jews were able to practice Judaism in Kobe. And I'll add here that one of the main stories of the refugees in Kobe are the yeshivas who escaped through Kobe, particularly the Mir, which I believe was the only yeshiva to escape in full. I won't cover that much in this talk for a couple of reasons. One, that the yeshiva communities have done a really nice job of documenting their experiences, although it hasn't really made the story much into popular or general nonfiction. So I will cover it in hopefully in my book. But for the sake of time in this presentation, I'm only going to brush the surface of the yeshiva stories, but it is a very important part of the story. And I've come across many resources about the yeshivas, so again, feel free to get in touch. There was a general desire to practice Jewish ritual among many of the refugees. Bela Mintz, in her oral testimony, recalled the strenuous efforts of her mother to keep kosher. She said, we had rented a room by these Japanese people, and my mother shared the kitchen with them. Concerned about keeping kosher, her mother wondered how to tell the Japanese woman that she shouldn't use the burner that she had reserved for cooking kosher food. So she bought this, the Bela called it a metal thing that you put over the burner to protect it. And her mother would cook on that one burner. And she somehow managed to tell the Japanese mother, because she recalled them worshiping, seeing them worship the Buddha. She said, worship the Buddha, quote, and when they worshiped, they clapped their hands. So she, her mother, went to clap her hands, and then she showed above, pointing upwards, and then she pointed at the burner. And she explained that burner in this way, without words. She explained that burner is part of her religion, so they're not to take it away or anything. And Bela says, and they didn't touch it. They stayed away because they knew it had to do with religion, with worship. And then just quickly, there's the telegram at the bottom in response to one from Kobe to the rabbis in Israel. There was confusion and care taken over how to fast across international date line. That's an interesting part of the story. The next slide. A central part of this hidden history that I want to uncover and reveal is how Kobe citizens and its Jewish refugees lived together and shaped each other. Leo Hanen, who was, again, one of the leaders of JewCom, in a 1975 letter recalled, articles appearing in the Japanese newspapers with some photographs which describe these people as refugees. Sorry, articles appeared in the Japanese newspapers with some photographs which describe these people as refugees, Jews from the war in Europe on their way to other countries, passing through Japan as a transit point only. I can summarize the attitude of almost all Japanese people in one word, kawaiso, which means like poor unfortunate. So they were sorry for them. There was no anti-Semitism to the refugees in Kobe, only compassion and kindness. At that time in Japan, there was a shortage of food. The foods were not available, such as butter, oil, chickens, eggs, etc. But whenever the refugees came to the grocery stores, somehow the shopkeepers would manage to offer them those rare commodities. How can I ever forget one day we received a letter from a farmer telling us that he heard of the plight of the Jews and that we had about 60 children as refugees, and that these farmers would be honored if we would allow them to distribute fruits they had grown to these little children. So they came next week with boxes and boxes of fresh, beautiful apples and oranges to present each child with some of the fruits. Okay. It's also fascinating in the historical record left behind by the Kobe citizens that they themselves were fascinated by the Jewish refugees. If you go to the next slide, this shows a photography exhibit by this rather famous Osaka photography club, the Tampai Photography Club, which was a photography exhibit of pictures taken of the refugees. The title was Displaced Jews, roughly translates to Displaced Jews, or it's sort of between evacuated and displaced Jews. The contemporary Japanese historian Takayoshi Iwata gathered testimony from Kobe citizens who remembered the refugees themselves or as stories about them from their parents. Summarized testimony from a man who lived in Kobe when he was about 9 years old. The Japanese man recalled in 1941 that there was a dilapidated 3-story wooden house where about 20 Jewish people resided. This man recalled observing the Jewish refugees wearing tattered overcoats and hats. In the international port city that is Kobe, it was a time in history when it was generally frowned upon to have close contact with foreigners, including Jewish refugees. And he mentioned that there was some sense of hesitation about offering supplies or associating with Jews who had fled Europe. But his family owned an oil shop nearby, and he remembers that his mother carrying things over to the Jewish residents in the evening after dark, though he was instructed never to talk about it. There was no idea to exactly what she was carrying, but she wrapped items in her apron to deliver them unnoticed, understanding their plight, and he thought perhaps she understood it due to her employment at a trading company, so she may have had a sort of better understanding of the global situation. Another account noticed that the local bathhouses closed one day to let the Jews take a bath free of charge, although later on in Iwata's report, I also found a line about a newspaper report and other records that were capturing daily interactions with Jewish refugees and citizens in Kobe that just described the commotion that ensued whenever the refugees entered a bathhouse. So, they closed again, maybe partly charitably, partly out of pragmatism. Akira Kitade, who's another historian, Japanese historian and writer who's deeply interested in this history, did an interview with a Kobe citizen who was a child at the time and who lived next door to a German diplomat's family, not German Jewish, but German diplomat's family, who was there with his wife and children. And this person said, "My memory recalls that it was the summer of my first year in elementary school when a lot of Jews came. They seemed to share the few Western-style houses. It seemed that they did not stay there for a very long time. Several other groups came and went. They are Jews in spite of speaking German," whispered Jikian, which is the daughter of the German diplomat. She was a child, and yet she held clear hostility towards them, this Kobe citizen noticed. And then he says, "One day I saw a boy with his father, his left hand entwined in his father's right arm. His face was pressed into his father's chest. I felt jealous. I felt so jealous because I couldn't do that with my father. A few days later, when an evening shower began falling, the boy ran into my house, staring at his white, slender hands and feet. My grandmother murmured, 8 or 9. Aware to some extent of the situation that led them to Kobe, my grandmother said, "Off you go now," and gave him a paper umbrella. The next day, the party of refugees gathered next door in a vacant lot, and they departed. They were wearing winter clothes, although it was a hot summer day. The boy who was wearing short pants and short sleeves the day before was now wearing long sleeves and long pants, but the paper umbrella my grandmother had handed the boy was not there. Okay. I'm going to try to move through the last slides very quickly because I realize we're running out of time. The next one, just as this quote gestures to that I just read, while the refugees were in Kobe, of course, there were the shadows of the Nazi alliance. This is a picture of a visit of the Hitler Youth in 1938 at the Concordia Club, which was a club that was in Kobe. It was at the they rented space from the Kobe Hotel, and so this shows a picture of them in 1938 at this hotel, which was right in the area where the refugees would end up living. And of course, from September of 1940, the Japanese government was, as I said, militarily aligned with the Nazis. And there was a German and Nazi presence in Kobe because it was a major port. I'm just going to skip some of this just for the sake of time. And the next slide shows that there was a Nazi presence in both Tokyo and Kobe. In November of 1940, the celebration for Japan's supposed 2,600 year anniversary of its founding involved a Hitler Youth visit. Though they didn't visit in Kobe, there would have been news about this throughout the entire country. And in September of 1941, there was an anti-espionage league that held an anti-Semitic rally in Tokyo, adopting the resolution that the, quote, Jewish aspiration to dominate the world is not compatible with the spirit of the Japanese Empire. In addition to this to this shadow of the Nazi alliance, on the next slide, you'll see another aspect that kind of hung as a shadow of the refugees was the specter of Shanghai. Especially after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the position of the Jews in Kobe became difficult. The Japanese authorities grew anxious about harboring foreigners and began applying pressure to the authorities for a speedy transfer of the refugees. Permission to stay in Japan was granted for increasingly shorter amounts of time. And in the end, out of the approximately 4,000 refugees, there remained about 1,098, mainly Polish Jews who were unable to obtain their ultimate immigration papers. And the next slide shows that Shanghai's conditions were widely known and because they were widely known and widely reported, they caused much anxiety among the refugee population who were stuck in Japan, anxiety and some rumors that they were going to be deported, which turned out to be true. On August 30th in 1941, the governor of Hyogo issued a report titled Matters Concerning Jewish Refugees Leaving Japan, which reported a national mandate that all Jewish refugees, regardless of whether or not they had visas, but just hadn't acted on them because they hadn't been able to secure the funds to get out, anyone should be quickly sent to Shanghai, and if they were going to try to obtain a visa, they should try to obtain one there. And on September 17th of 1941, the steamship, the Taiyo Maru, left Kobe port for Shanghai, and it was reportedly the last ship to carry Jewish refugees from Kobe. A couple were left, some who were sick. For the main, everybody was transported to Shanghai who hadn't been able to get out. The next slide shows a picture of the Jews leaving Kobe from the Osaka Mainichi Shimbun on August 21st, and its rival paper, the Osaka Asahi, described the same departure, writing, "They were variably dressed, some wearing a thick winter overcoat and some a frock, and some trying to take with them everything they could, from pots and pans to even kegs for pickled vegetables. Their expressions were full of anxiety as they were about to embark on another voyage, showing their wistful feelings for what they are leaving behind." Okay, so quickly in the next slide, why did the Japanese government tolerate and sometimes even facilitate the harboring of the Jews, both in Japan and then in Shanghai, which was run by the Japanese government. It had been colonized. So there were and why did they, as you can see in these two pictures, this is a picture of a short transit visa, and then the other picture shows the application to extend it, which they repeatedly did over and over. So why did they allow this harboring of Jews? Partly their attitude was shaped by little contact with Jews. Before World War I, there were only 1,000, estimated 1,000 who had settled in all of Japan at any time since the opening of Japan in the 1860s. Although the Protocols of the Elders of Zion had been translated in Japan in 1924, published in Japanese. So there were different and at times conflicting interests in and about Jews. In Japan, different interests in and belief about Jews. The next slide quickly shows a picture of a letter from Leo Hanin, where he says there was definitely no anti-Semitism or anti-foreignism expressed to the Kobe community on the part of the Japanese authorities. But what there does seem to have been was, as the historian Casey Pallister put it, a group of, quote, Jewish experts in the Japanese government who did not personally hope for the immediate and complete destruction of international Jewry. Instead, they adopted a more pragmatic approach for dealing with, quote, the Jewish problem, ultimately concluding that some Jews were harmless and some could be exploited, particularly exploited for the economic and industrial support of the settlement of various areas of Manchukuo, which was Japanese-occupied China. Also, the hope to appeal to the U.S.'s good graces by their own fair treatment of the Jews, by the Japanese' own fair treatment of the Jews. And it also served to promote the sort of Japanese narrative or self-image of supporting racial equality, despite their alliance with Germany, particularly in light of the U.S. and British refusal to accept Japan's so-called racial equality proposal as an amendment to the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, and the U.S. discrimination against Japanese and other Asian immigrants, which was particularly heightening throughout the 1920s, 30s, and very early 40s. The next slide shows a quote from another Leo Hanin letter showing that at a dinner party given by JUCOM leaders, the prefectural governor actually urges Poniewozik to tell the American Jews how Japan protected Europe's Jewish refugees. And we can see on the next slide the different sort of official lines that the Japanese government took towards Jews throughout the time. Even Matsuoka, the foreign minister who himself signed the tripartite alliance with Germany, announced in 1940, anti-Semitism will never be adopted by Japan. True, I conducted a treaty with Hitler, but I never promised him to be an anti-Semite. And this is not my personal opinion, but is a principle of the entire Japanese government. I will, on the next slide, just quickly show that privately there was some vacillation. There was a fascinating historical chapter involving a private meeting with the leaders of the Kobe Jewish community and Japanese officials who called the leaders of JUCOM to Tokyo to have a meeting. And basically, in Leo Hanin's testimony, he was there as a translator. He's shown on the very right. In Leo Hanin's testimony, at one point, the Japanese officials asked, "Why do our friends, the Germans, hate you so much? Like, what's wrong with you people, basically?" And one of the rabbis, the Ashimanover rabbi, sort of very quickly thought of a response, and he said, "They hate us because we are Asiatic people." If you go to the next slide, you'll see. And he said, they hate us, they hate the Slavs, they hate anyone who is not considered Aryan, and they also and you are also not considered Aryan, and so you're next on the list, basically. And the Japanese officials sort of took a moment to ponder this, and then eventually came back and said, "Okay, you can go back to your homes in Kobe, and you won't be bothered." Which brings us to the final uh, myth or story that shaped Jewish survival in Japan. And this returns us to the JDC's founding, which is that Jacob Schiff, the head of Kuhn Loeb and Company, sort of accidentally in the early 1900s during the Russo-Japanese War, met this minister from the Bank of Japan when Japan was looking for funding to help its war against Russia. And Schiff, who was a German Jew, very, very prominent, arranged a $200 million loan for the Japanese government to help support the war effort. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that Takahashi himself said, Schiff had a grudge against Russia on account of his Judaism. He was justly indignant at their unfair treatment of the Jewish population by the Russian government. There were pogroms going on. Of course, there had been long-term oppression of the Jews in the Pale of Settlement. And Takahashi believed that this was a main reason why Schiff wanted to support the Japanese war effort. This, of course, in some ways, ties into this myth of the Jews as having some kind of mystical power, which is part of the myth that the Nazis, in fact, used to bolster their own power and to scapegoat the Jewish minority. But it is also, interestingly, one of a series of narratives, myths, and projections, which clearly fascinated and then swayed some factions of the Japanese government, and it ended up playing a part in Jewish survival in Nazi-allied Japan during the early stages of the Holocaust. And I'll end with this quote on the last slide: "The total absence of clashes or unfortunate episodes provides for the annals of Jewish refugee travels through Japan, a document which will serve as an example of tolerance and human sympathy to all nations and to coming generations." And this was written by the JUCOM leaders. And the pieces of the story that I want to resurrect and dig up and reveal are related to this. This passage through Kobe and its uniquely fascinating aspects are ones that I want to dig up and reveal. Also, again, the Jewish agency and this survival story, which goes hand in hand with the heroism of Sugiura, and the coexistence and the grace that accompanied it of the Jewish refugees and the Japanese citizens, while Japan was officially and militarily aligned with Hitler. And while the Japanese military was committing its own confounding atrocities in its own occupied territories. So this is another reason that this story, I believe, is crucial today, because it highlights the difference between a population and its government and military. And it's something that I think is important for us to remember, particularly today.
Thank you, Tracy. This has been a fascinating lecture. We will now open the floor to questions. Just a reminder that your microphones are muted and you can send us questions via the Q&A function. And Tracy, I see that we already have a few questions. We probably won't have time to go over all the questions, but we'll share them with you afterwards.
Okay. Sorry, Isabel, can you also put my email in the chat? Because I want it, make sure if people have questions that don't get answered, that you can either check my website or my email. If you don't have my email, you can find it on the website, because I want to make sure we have time to answer everything.
We will put your email in the follow-up email that will go out
okay,
tomorrow, which, so I think that could be helpful to the attendees. What were the reasons for Jews calling Japan home prior to the Holocaust?
Yeah, so there were both Russian and Sephardic Jews who had come to Japan. The Russian Jews in general came to escape Russia and to escape the pogroms, and some went to Japan occupied China, and but there was ended up being tension in Harbin and in Manchuria between particularly the white Russian community and the Jewish community. So many of those people left and came to Japan. And there were a lot of there was a Sephardic community in Kobe, which also actually helped support the refugees, although there were some language issues, which made it difficult. But they were there as traders. That's the reason why there was a Jewish community, a small Jewish community in Kobe.
Actually, we have a question just hitting on this. Someone says, I believe there were Sephardic Jews in Kobe doing business before the Holocaust years. Did they play any role in helping the refugees?
Yeah, so they did actually, but they were not officially part of JUCOM. So because JUCOM was so supported by the JDC archives, for the purpose of this talk, I haven't shown much documentation, but there's actually a fascinating memoir that was written by one of the members of the Sephardic community. So feel free to get in touch and I can give you the name and the link to that memoir. And you can read where she writes about helping to support the refugees, giving food, giving advice, stuff like that.
And we have a follow-up question also on the original Jewcom families. How did they fare as the war progressed? Where are the descendants now? And did they remain in Kobe?
Okay, so I believe most of them did not remain in Kobe, although some remained in Japan. Most of them, I think, moved to Tokyo, but there is a Jewish community in Kobe today. I just don't think they're the descendants of Jewcom. So during the war, the Jewish residents of Japan were moved out to the countryside, and there's documentation suggesting that they were actually about to be interned when Japan was invaded by the Allied forces, and they were liberated. Basically, they were living in the countryside. They didn't have a choice in that, but they were not harmed. So I mean, it wasn't great conditions, but they were not rounded up, at least by the time the war ended.
Okay, so now let's move to the refugees themselves. Why was Kobe a destination for refugees from Kovno? And did the refugees know where they were headed?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I don't think that the refugees knew that they were headed to Kobe. That's such an interesting question. I never thought about it. You get the sense in the testimony that when they arrive in Suruga, they don't really know where they're going, but the JUCOM community meets them and takes them to Kobe. Why they went to Kobe, I think one of the main reasons, if not a main, like one of the main reasons why the Japanese government allowed them to stay was because there was a Jewish community that was willing to support them. They weren't going to become a burden on the Japanese government. So there was JUCOM there, and then of course JUCOM had the backing of the JDC and some other charities. Kobe was the largest Jewish community in Japan at the time, even though it was small. And there was, as I think I mentioned, a smaller community in Yokohama, but they went to Kobe because that's the only place where there was an established Jewish community, basically, with enough members to be able to muster support.
There seems to be a pretty large difference between the numbers of female and male refugees. Do you know why?
Yeah, a lot of that is because of the yeshivas, and I am sorry that I didn't have more time to spend on the yeshiva story. Is there were a large number of refugees who were yeshivas, so one of the reasons is because there were a large number of yeshiva students, and also because another reason that I've seen in the documentation is that greater number of men who were not themselves single, but who were in families left Poland when they could still get out, because originally the belief was that women and children would be safe, and so people escaped Poland. I'm sorry, to Lithuania, and then had many of them had left their families behind, and then if they could get them out, they could get them out to Lithuania, but many of them couldn't. So both of those reasons.
And there's a question actually specific to religious religious female refugees. Where did they go to the mikveh? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know. I did see documentation that there was a mikveh and there was oh, now I'm forgetting the word, someone who could slaughter animals, according to kosher custom. It's gone out of my head, the word. But so there was, I don't know where the mikveh was. That's a great question. I need to find that out. Yeah, I don't know.
And there are a number of questions about where the refugees went after the war. How many went to Palestine? Do you know?
Yeah. So there was a slide that showed where the refugees went, like where the boats went, um, from Ponevesky. And if you email me, I'll send you a copy of that document, this screenshot, which shows the information. There's also in the JDC archives I didn't show it, a list of where people went. So I have the information, I just don't have it on the top of my head.
And also some questions about the transport of refugees from Kobe to Shanghai. Were they under Japanese armed guards? How did, yeah.
Yeah, so the situation in Shanghai changed. It was never a good situation. There was also always a ton of poverty and a ton of crowding. But up until 1943, Japan had kind of held off Nazi pressure to round up the Jews. And then in 1943, they agreed to put them in a ghetto in one area of Shanghai. So they were under armed guard. Well, there was a Japanese military presence in Shanghai the entire time, but it became more strenuous for the Jews because they were put in a ghetto, and where they had to go through a guarded sort of gate to leave. And there were some Jews who resisted that and were taken to notoriously horrible prison, and died. Some reports say that they died from being tortured in the prison, although the only documentation that I can find that seems certain about what happened with them is that they died afterwards, soon after, from illness contracted in the prison. But nobody thinks that the conditions were good in the prison. So.
And then, sorry, the questions are jumping a little bit as we answer them. I think there are a few questions about the language you used in your research. So someone wants to know whether you read Japanese, and someone wants to know in what language the documents were that you found in the JDC archives.
The JDC archives documents were all in English. Now I don't think there are some documents in the JDC archive, I think, that are not in English, but I didn't look at them. The ones that are between JUCOM and JDC are all in English. So the ones that I felt like I really needed for my research, and I might be stating, I can't remember. I know in the Holocaust Museum archives there are ones that are not in English, so I'm sorry, I might be getting them confused. But yeah, I do read some Japanese, and I speak some Japanese, and then I rely on my husband and son. If there's something that either I can't translate, or also sometimes if I see something in translation, it's like that's been translated into English, and I think I don't know whether this is perfectly captures the essence. I will ask my husband, is that how you would translate it? So because he is Japanese, native Japanese, grew up in Japan, lived in Japan his whole life.
We just have time, unfortunately, for one or two questions. And sure. What was Do you know of the role of Abraham Kotsuji in lengthening the visas? Can you say something
Yeah.
about it?
He has such a big and fascinating role, and he was in that picture that I had to go through really quickly from the May 1941 meeting. He's a fascinating figure, and I just didn't have time to fit him into this presentation. So let me say quickly two things. One is I have a lot of documentation about him, so feel free to get in touch and I can tell you more. But briefly, he was a Japanese man who was fascinated by Judaism and embraced Judaism and did an incredible amount to support the refugees while they were in Kobe. Particularly, he worked as a kind of go-between between the authorities and JUCOM and was very instrumental in helping to get the transit visas extended. And he ended up converting to Judaism and moving to Israel. He's buried actually in Israel. So he's a fascinating figure. And I wish I had had time to fit him in. I will fit him into the book, but I just couldn't for this presentation.
And there's another very specific question. Oh, of course it's jumped. Who is Takayoshi Iwata? Do you know?
Oh, who is he? Is that the question?
Yes, who is he?
Okay. He's a Japanese historian. He's a professor who's affiliated with Kobe University. It might be Kobe City University, actually. I'm sorry, I have his exact title. So Kobe's made a big effort since in the past like 20, 25 years to highlight its Jewish history and the Jewish refugees who came through Kobe. And he's someone who's been very involved in gathering testimony, and he also has had his center that he runs at Kobe, at Kobe, I think it's City University. He has translated a lot of the stuff too into English, so that also makes it easier for researchers. And I'm happy to send that info along to anyone who wants it.
His work has been published in English. His research has
So
been.
he did the report where the report that he gathered where he interviewed well, he didn't actually interview, he gathered, they requested information from people who either were lived in Kobe at the time the refugees were there, or whose parents had, or relatives, and heard testimony about it. And he gathered that information and published a report in Japanese. And then that report was translated. It actually wasn't translated by him, but it was translated by his center. And that is in English. So it exists in both English and Japanese. And I'm happy to send the link to that to anyone who's interested.
Thank you, Tracy. And Tracy's email is in the chat if anyone wants to make a note of it. And we will close the questions, but we'll share them with you. Thank you again, Tracy. I also want to thank again Sorel and Lauren Chassin for the generosity. And I want to thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you.
Today's webinar was recorded and it will be available on the JDC archives in about 2 weeks' time. You can also find many recordings of our past public programs there. Our next program will take place on May 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Rachel Biblinger will give a talk on her new book, Saving Our Survivors: How American Jews Learned About the Holocaust. You can sign up for the program via our website or social media. And if you would like to stay informed about upcoming events, we invite you to sign up for our e-newsletter. We look forward to welcoming you for future programs. And thank you so much for being with us today.